They thought the ranch would be easy tonight. 12 riders, a quiet house, and one lonely woman standing under a lantern, but none of them knew Elias Carter was already there. The prairie after midnight has a way of holding its breath, the wind sliding low across the dry grass, the moon hanging pale above 40 acres of silent land. Clara Whitmore stood on the porch of her small ranch house, one hand gripping the wooden rail as the sound of approaching horses rolled across the dark like distant thunder. She counted them without meaning to. 1, 3, 5. Then more shapes forming out of the night until a dozen riders circled the yard, their horses snorting clouds into the cold air. A lantern burned beside the door, its yellow light barely reaching the fence line, but it was enough for Clara to see the men watching her. Their leader sat tall in the saddle, hat tipped low, voice slow and confident when he finally spoke across the open yard. "Evenin', miss," he said, like he was greeting a neighbor instead of surrounding a ranch. Clara didn't answer. The wind carried the smell of leather, dust, and horse sweat across the porch boards. She knew men like this had been moving through the county for weeks. Quiet farms, lonely ranches, places where help was 20 miles away and the nearest sheriff might not arrive until morning. One of the riders dismounted and wandered toward the barn, boots crunching gravel with slow, careless steps. He looked around the property the way a buyer studies land before making an offer. The barn doors were closed, the corral empty except for 2 horses tied along the rail. Clara could feel her heart beating harder, but her voice stayed steady when she finally spoke. "This ranch ain't for sale." A few of the riders chuckled softly. The leader leaned forward in his saddle, studying her like a puzzle he hadn't solved yet. "We ain't here to buy it," he said. Somewhere behind the barn, a loose board creaked in the wind. None of the riders noticed. The man walking near the barn kicked at the dirt and reached for the handle of the big wooden door. "Let's see what you got in there," he called to the others. The night stayed quiet for a long second. Then the barn door moved, slowly, almost lazily, before opening just enough for a tall silhouette to step into the thin spill of moonlight. Dust hung in the air behind him. A long coat brushed against his boots. The brim of an old brown Stetson cast a shadow across a weathered face, but the lantern light caught one detail clear as daylight, a thin scar cutting across the man's left eyebrow. The rider near the barn stopped moving. The others turned their heads one by one as the stranger rested a gloved hand lightly on the rail fence and looked across the yard at the 12 horses and the men sitting on them. He didn't hurry, didn't raise his voice, didn't even reach for the revolver resting at his hip. He simply stood there like he had been part of the ranch all along. And for the first time since they arrived, the leader of the riders narrowed his eyes, because something about the quiet confidence of the man by the barn suddenly felt very different from the easy job they thought they rode into. The wind shifted again across the prairie, carrying dust through the yard, and the stranger finally spoke, his voice calm and steady in the dark. "You boys picked the wrong ranch tonight." None of them had asked his name yet, but within the next few seconds, they were going to wish they had. The riders did not move at first, and the silence stretched across the ranch yard like a long shadow under the moon. The man near the barn slowly lowered his hand from the door as he studied the stranger standing a few feet away, dust drifting across the boards between them. The stranger did not step closer, did not lift his voice, and did not rush for the revolver resting at his hip. He simply stood with the calm stillness of someone who had spent most of his life under wide skies where patience mattered more than speed. Out on the porch, Clara Whitmore watched the moment unfold, her lantern shaking slightly in her hand as the wind moved across the prairie grass. The leader of the riders leaned forward in his saddle, eyes narrowing as if trying to pull a memory from somewhere far away. The stranger by the barn looked like any other trail rider at first glance. His coat was long and dusty, the color of dry sand after a hard summer. His boots were worn from miles of riding. The brim of his brown Stetson was bent slightly from years of weather and travel, and along the left side of that brim a small clean hole showed where a bullet had once passed through without touching the man wearing it. The lantern light reached his face just enough to reveal the thin scar above his left eyebrow and the steady gray-blue eyes that watched the riders without hurry. A silver horseshoe pendant rested against the front of his shirt, glinting softly when the wind moved his coat aside. None of the riders spoke for several seconds. Horses shifted their weight in the dirt, leather creaking quietly in the still air. Finally, the leader cleared his throat and called out across the yard. His voice sounded different now, less certain than before. "You work here?" The stranger tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question like a man deciding whether it deserved an answer. Clara could see his right hand covered by a dark leather glove resting loosely near his belt. There was no tension in his shoulders, no sign of fear in the way he stood under the moonlight. He looked like someone waiting for a long story to reach the interesting part. "Just passing through," the stranger said at last, his voice low and steady, carrying across the yard without effort. One of the younger riders laughed nervously from the back of the group, but the sound faded quickly when the leader raised a hand for silence. The man on the horse studied the stranger again, his eyes traveling slowly from the scar on the eyebrow to the old Stetson hat, then down to the calm posture that did not belong to someone caught alone against 12 armed men. The wind moved again across the open land, brushing through the fence posts and rattling the loose tin along the barn roof. Clara noticed something then that made her grip the porch rail tighter. The stranger had not looked at her once since stepping out of the barn. His attention stayed on the riders, steady and patient, like a man who had already measured the distance between every horse and every shadow in the yard. The leader shifted in his saddle again. Something in his expression changed slowly, the way a man changes his mind after remembering an old story, told around a campfire years ago. His gaze returned to the stranger's face, and this time it stayed there longer. The scar above the left eyebrow, the old Stetson with the bullet hole, the quiet confidence of a man who did not need to explain himself. A whisper moved through the riders behind him, barely louder than the wind crossing the prairie. The leader exhaled slowly through his nose, his eyes growing sharper as recognition finally reached him. And in that quiet moment, standing under the pale moonlight of the open ranch yard, he began to realize exactly who had stepped out of that barn. The whisper moved through the riders like dry grass bending under a slow wind, and even the horses seemed to sense that something had changed in the air. The leader sat very still in his saddle now, his eyes locked on the tall man standing beside the barn, studying every detail the way a gambler studies the cards on the table before placing his last wager. The moonlight slid across the ranch yard, touching the fence posts, the quiet barn, and the dust drifting around the stranger's boots. Clara Whitmore could feel the shift even from the porch. The laughter that had filled the yard minutes earlier had vanished, replaced by the quiet tension of men suddenly unsure of the ground beneath them. The stranger remained exactly where he was, one gloved hand resting loosely near his belt, the other hanging calm at his side. The silver horseshoe pendant moved gently when the wind brushed across his coat. His eyes did not wander. They remained steady on the riders, patient and unhurried, like a man who had already seen the ending of this moment long before anyone else realized the story had begun. The leader cleared his throat again, but this time the sound carried a trace of hesitation. "You said you were just passing through," he called out slowly. The man by the barn gave a slight nod. "That is right." His voice was calm, not challenging, not angry, just certain. One of the riders shifted in his saddle and leaned closer to the man beside him. "You see that scar?" he whispered under his breath. Another rider murmured something that Clara could not quite hear, but the effect was clear. Several heads turned again toward the stranger's face. The wind pushed the brim of the old Stetson just enough to reveal the mark above the left eyebrow more clearly. The leader's eyes followed it carefully. He looked at the hat next. The small hole along the left side of the brim caught the lantern glow for half a second. That tiny detail seemed to settle something in the man's mind. Clara noticed the change immediately. The leader straightened slightly in the saddle, and the confidence that had filled his voice earlier did not return. Instead, there was a thoughtful quiet as he studied the figure beside the barn one more time, measuring memory against the man standing in front of him. Stories travel far across the prairie. Some begin in dusty saloons, others around slow campfires under open skies. They change a little each time they are told, but certain details remain the same. A quiet rider, a scar over the left eyebrow, a Stetson hat that once stopped a bullet from finding its mark. Clara had heard a few of those stories herself during long winters when travelers stopped by the ranch for coffee and warmth. She had never known whether to believe them. The leader shifted his grip on the reins and finally spoke again, but this time his voice was lower. You got a name, mister? The man beside the barn did not move right away. For a moment, he seemed to consider the question the same way a man might consider whether rain was coming over the distant hills. Then he lifted his chin just slightly, the lantern light touching the calm lines of his weathered face. Elias, he said simply. The wind passed across the yard again, carrying dust and the faint smell of hay from the barn. Several riders exchanged uneasy looks. The leader stared at the man for a few seconds longer before slowly exhaling through his nose. His gaze dropped once more to the scar, then back to the gray-blue eyes that watched him without fear. In that quiet moment, the leader understood something the others were only beginning to realize. The ranch they had chosen tonight was not empty after all, and the man standing in the moonlight had a name that traveled farther than most riders ever could. The name settled over the ranch yard like dust after a long ride, quiet but heavy enough that every man there could feel it. The leader did not speak right away. His fingers tightened slightly on the reins as he watched the tall rider by the barn, measuring the calm posture, the steady eyes, the kind of patience that only came from years of riding across land where men learned quickly which fights were worth their time. Behind him, one of the younger riders shifted in his saddle again and whispered something nervous to the man beside him. But the leader raised a hand without looking back, and the whisper stopped immediately. The wind crossed the open prairie once more, brushing the grass and sliding along the fence rails before rattling a loose piece of tin on the barn roof. Elias Carter did not move. He stood the same way he had from the beginning, one boot planted in the dust, shoulders relaxed, hat brim low enough to shade his eyes from the lantern glow. The silver horseshoe pendant moved lightly against his chest as the wind passed through the yard. Clara Whitmore watched everything from the porch, the lantern in her hand casting a small circle of light across the boards at her feet. She had heard the name clearly. Elias. The stories she had heard over the past few winters came back slowly. Pieces of conversation from travelers who stopped by her ranch during cold nights when the fire was burning and the coffee pot stayed warm on the stove. Some said he had once ridden alone through a blizzard to guide a lost wagon train to safety. Others claimed he had settled a land dispute between two families simply by standing in the middle of the road and refusing to move until both men remembered their better sense. The details were always different, but one thing remained the same in every story. The man never raised his voice. The man never needed to. Out in the yard, the leader finally exhaled slowly, the kind of breath a man takes when he realizes the road ahead is not the one he expected to ride. He tipped his hat back slightly so he could see the face by the barn more clearly. The scar above the left eyebrow. The old Stetson with the quiet bullet hole along the brim. The calm gray-blue eyes that had not looked away once since the riders arrived. The leader shifted his horse half a step to the side and spoke again, his voice lower now, stripped of the careless confidence that had filled it earlier in the night. You staying here long, Carter? The question drifted across the yard like a test. Elias considered it for a moment. The wind lifted the edge of his coat again and settled. Long enough, he replied calmly. No threat. No anger. Just certainty. The words hung in the air between the barn and the riders. Several men in the group exchanged quiet looks with each other. One of them glanced toward the dark road behind them, as if calculating how far it was back to the main trail. The leader noticed the movement. His jaw tightened slightly, but he did not scold them. Instead, he looked back at Elias Carter, and for the first time that night his eyes showed something that had not been there before. Respect mixed with caution. The kind of respect men develop after hearing the same name travel across too many miles to ignore. The prairie wind carried the smell of dry hay and distant sage across the ranch yard. For a few seconds nobody spoke. Then the leader slowly turned his horse in a small circle, studying the ranch house, the barn, and the quiet man standing between them. The job that had seemed simple when they rode and suddenly looked very different now. And somewhere deep in his mind, the leader understood that sometimes the difference between an easy night and a long story people talk about for years is just one quiet rider standing exactly where he chooses to stand. The wind moved slowly across the ranch yard again, brushing through the fence rails and stirring the dust around Elias Carter's boots. And for a long moment, the only sound came from the quiet shifting of horses under their riders. The leader studied the man beside the barn as if he were trying to solve a puzzle that had suddenly become much more complicated than it looked from the road. When they first rode in, the ranch had seemed like any other lonely place on the frontier: a widow, a barn, a few horses, and 40 acres of land sitting under the open sky with no neighbors close enough to hear trouble if it came. Now the same ranch looked different. The lantern light on the porch revealed Clara Whitmore standing straight despite the wind tugging at the edge of her blouse, her eyes fixed on the riders in the yard. Behind her, the ranch house stood quiet and dark except for the single window glowing faintly near the door. The barn remained still as well, its tall shadow stretching across the dirt where Elias Carter waited without hurry. The leader finally shifted his weight in the saddle and glanced back at his men. A few of them had turned slightly in their saddles, their attention drifting toward the dark trail they had ridden in from earlier that night. None of them spoke, but their posture had changed. The easy confidence they carried when they arrived had been replaced by something more cautious. Stories traveled fast across the frontier, and sometimes a man heard enough of them that he learned when to listen. The leader turned back toward Elias again and rested both hands on the saddle horn. "This ranch belongs to you?" he asked slowly. Elias shook his head once. "No." The answer was simple and calm. The leader looked toward the porch where Clara stood. "Your place then, miss?" Clara hesitated only a second before answering. "Yes." Her voice carried across the yard clearly despite the wind. The leader nodded once as if confirming something in his mind. For several seconds he said nothing else. His eyes returned to Elias Carter, studying the tall figure beside the barn once more. The moonlight touched the scar above the left eyebrow and the faint shine of the silver horseshoe pendant. A man could ride 1,000 miles across the frontier and still hear that name spoken in quiet conversations along the way. Sometimes the stories were about cattle disputes settled without a single harsh word. Sometimes they were about travelers helped through storms or lost wagons guided back to safe trails. The details changed depending on who told the story, but one fact stayed the same. Wherever Elias Carter happened to be standing, trouble usually decided to find another road. The leader exhaled slowly and leaned back in his saddle, letting the reins loosen slightly in his hands. His horse lowered its head and snorted softly into the dust. The riders behind him waited without speaking. Finally, the leader looked once more at the quiet man by the barn and gave a small nod that only someone watching closely might notice. "Long night for riding," he said to his men. A few of them shifted immediately, turning their horses a few inches toward the dark road beyond the fence line. The leader gave the ranch one last look before guiding his horse slowly around. The lantern light on the porch flickered in the wind as the group began to drift away from the yard, one rider at a time. No one hurried. No one looked back. And beside the barn, Elias Carter remained exactly where he had been from the beginning, calm and silent, watching the last rider fade into the darkness of the prairie trail. The sound of the riders faded slowly into the open prairie, the rhythm of 12 horses turning into 11, then 10, then fewer as distance swallowed the noise, and the ranch yard returned to the quiet it had known before the night was broken. Dust drifted through the lantern light near the porch, moving in soft spirals before settling back onto the hard earth. Clara Whitmore stood very still for several seconds, her hand still wrapped around the lantern handle even though the riders were already halfway to the trail beyond the low ridge. The wind brushed across the yard again and lifted a strand of her chestnut hair, but she did not notice. Her eyes remained fixed on the dark road where the silhouettes of the men had slowly disappeared. Beside the barn, Elias Carter had not moved either. He watched the empty horizon the same way he had watched the riders, patient and silent, as if making certain the night had truly decided to stay peaceful again. A lone horse tied near the corral shifted its weight and gave a quiet snort into the cool air. The barn roof creaked gently as the wind slid over the boards. Slowly, Clara stepped down from the porch and walked a few yards into the open yard, the lantern casting a warm circle of light across the dust. When she stopped, she looked toward the barn where Elias stood beneath the pale moon. "Are they gone?" she asked. Her voice sounded smaller now that the tension of the moment had begun to fade. Elias glanced once more toward the distant trail before answering. "They are riding away," he said calmly. Clara exhaled a breath she had not realized she had been holding. The lantern in her hand trembled slightly as the wind moved again. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The prairie stretched in every direction around the ranch, endless dark land under a sky filled with quiet stars. Finally, Clara took another step closer. They did not leave because of me, she said softly. Elias gave a small shrug beneath his dusty coat. They left because they remembered something. Clara tilted her head slightly, studying the calm lines of his face in the lantern glow. What did they remember? Elias rested his gloved hand lightly on the fence rail and looked out across the empty pasture where the riders had stood earlier that night. That trouble is not always worth the ride, he said. The words were simple, but Clara sensed the deeper meaning behind them. She had grown up on this land long enough to understand that reputation could travel farther than any horse. The stories people carried across the frontier could shape decisions long before a man reached the end of the road. The wind stirred the grass again, and the barn door creaked softly behind Elias. Clara followed his gaze toward the distant horizon where the riders had vanished. "Will they come back?" she asked quietly. Elias thought about the question for a moment. The moonlight caught the edge of the scar above his left eyebrow as he lifted his eyes toward the stars. "Not tonight," he replied. Clara nodded slowly. The ranch yard finally felt calm again, the kind of calm that settles after a storm passes somewhere far beyond the hills. The lantern flame flickered as the wind brushed across the porch steps behind her. Elias pushed away from the fence rail and turned toward the barn. "You should get some rest," he said gently. Clara hesitated before answering. "And you?" Elias glanced toward the quiet barn doorway and then out toward the open prairie once more. "I will stay awake a little longer," he said, because out on the frontier, a quiet night was something a wise rider always made sure to watch until the very end. The ranch slowly settled back into the quiet rhythm of the frontier night, but the silence felt different now, like land that had just witnessed something important and was still thinking about it. Clara Whitmore stood in the yard for another moment, the lantern casting a soft glow across the dust, while the stars above stretched wide and endless across the sky. The wind carried the faint smell of dry grass and distant sage, the kind of scent that belonged to land untouched for miles in every direction. Behind her, the porch boards creaked gently as the breeze slipped past the house. Elias Carter walked a few steps along the fence near the barn, his boots moving slowly through the dirt as he looked toward the open prairie where the riders had disappeared. He listened carefully to the night the way an experienced rancher listens to a herd, not just with his ears, but with patience. Out here the land spoke in small ways. The rustle of grass, the shift of a horse, the distant call of a coyote somewhere beyond the hills. Tonight the prairie sounded calm again. Clara finally lowered the lantern slightly and walked closer to the barn where Elias stood. The light revealed the dust on his coat and the faint glimmer of the silver horseshoe pendant resting against his shirt. Up close she could see the weathered lines in his face that came from years spent riding under open skies. He looked like a man who had crossed more miles than most people ever would. "You knew they would leave," Clara said quietly. Elias rested his gloved hand on the top rail of the fence and glanced toward her. "I hoped they would remember their scents," he answered. Clara looked back toward the empty trail once more. "You did not even reach for your revolver." Elias allowed the smallest hint of a smile. "Most men prefer to ride away before trouble becomes a story they regret." Clara considered that answer for a moment. The lantern light flickered between them while the wind moved softly across the pasture. "Where did you come from?" she asked after a while. Elias leaned his shoulder lightly against the fence post and looked out toward the distant line where the prairie met the dark hills. "A ranch about 30 miles west of here," he said. "I have been riding north for 2 days." Clara nodded slowly. 30 miles was not a short ride in this country, especially alone. "You stopped here for water," she said, remembering the quiet rider who had appeared at dusk asking only for a drink and a place to rest his horse. Elias gave a small nod. "You're well looked honest." The simple reply made Clara smile faintly despite the long night she had just endured. For a moment neither of them spoke. The prairie seemed to breathe around them again, calm and steady beneath the stars. Somewhere near the corral one of the horses stamped lightly and settled again. Finally Clara looked toward the barn door where Elias had stepped out earlier. "You could stay until morning," she offered. "The trail north will still be there when the sun rises." Elias turned his gaze toward the ranch house and then back toward the endless land stretching beyond the fences. A quiet man like him carried the feeling of the road even when he stood still. "I might do that," he said after a moment. Because sometimes even a rider who had seen half the frontier knew the value of a peaceful ranch under a sky full of stars, especially after a night when 12 strangers arrived and left without ever understanding how close they came to making a very different kind of story. The night grew deeper over the ranch, the kind of quiet that only settles across the frontier after the wind has carried the last echo of hoofbeats far beyond the hills. Clara Whitmore lifted the lantern slightly as she walked toward the barn, the soft light brushing across the wooden boards and the stacked hay inside. Elias Carter stood near the open doorway, his tall frame outlined against the pale glow of the moon that spilled through the gaps in the barn wall. The air smelled faintly of dry hay, leather, and the dust that always lived in places where horses and hard work shared the same ground. Clara paused a few steps away and looked out across the pasture again. The prairie stretched dark and endless, the fence line disappearing into a silver haze where moonlight touched the grass. It was hard to believe that only a short time earlier 12 riders had filled this same yard with tension and uncertainty. Now the land looked exactly as it always had, calm and patient, as if it had watched the whole moment unfold and quietly decided it was nothing worth remembering. Elias reached down and picked up a small wooden bucket near the stall and carried it to the water trough. He moved without hurry, the steady rhythm of someone used to long days around animals and open land. One of the ranch horses lifted its head and watched him curiously before lowering its muzzle to the water again. Clara rested the lantern on a nearby post and folded her arms lightly against the cool night air. "You ride alone often?" she asked after a moment. Elias poured the last of the water into the trough before setting the bucket down. "Most of the time," he answered. Clara nodded slowly. Out here that was not unusual. The frontier was full of riders who traveled miles of empty land with only the wind and the stars for company. Still, there was something about Elias Carter that made the quiet seem heavier, as if every mile he had crossed had left a small piece of story behind him. Clara glanced again toward the trail leading away from the ranch. "Those men knew your name," she said thoughtfully. Elias rested his arms on the fence rail beside the trough and watched the horses for a moment before replying. "Names travel farther than people sometimes." Clara tilted her head slightly. "Are the stories true?" The question hung gently in the air between them. Elias did not answer right away. He looked out across the pasture where the grass moved softly under the moonlight like waves across a dark sea. Finally, he spoke in the same calm tone he had used all night. "Most stories change a little each time they are told." Clara smiled faintly at that. The lantern flame flickered again as the wind shifted direction across the yard. Somewhere in the distance a coyote called once, the sound long and lonely before fading into the vast quiet of the prairie. Elias pushed away from the fence and walked back toward the barn door, brushing a bit of dust from his coat sleeve. "Morning comes early out here," he said. Clara nodded. "It does." For a moment, they both stood listening to the peaceful sounds of the ranch settling for the night. Yet Clara could not shake a small feeling that something about the evening was not quite finished. Out on the frontier, quiet often carried its own kind of warning, the sort that only people who lived far from towns learned to recognize. And somewhere beyond the dark hills, far past the reach of the lantern light, the trail those riders had taken still stretched across the prairie like a question waiting for the next answer. The lantern flame burned lower as the night moved slowly toward morning, and the ranch rested under a sky so wide it seemed to swallow every sound except the wind. Clara Whitmore stepped onto the porch again and looked across the yard where the barn stood quiet in the moonlight. The boards of the house creaked softly beneath her boots while the prairie breeze slipped through the cottonwood trees near the well. Out here, time had its own rhythm. Minutes stretched longer beneath the stars, and every small movement carried meaning. Inside the barn, Elias Carter had climbed the wooden ladder to the hayloft and now sat near the open window where the cool air drifted in. His old Stetson rested beside him on the boards, the bullet hole in the left brim catching a faint silver line of moonlight. Below him the horses shifted calmly in their stalls, their slow breathing filling the barn with a steady living warmth that softened the chill of the night. Elias leaned back against a beam and listened. A man who had spent decades riding across frontier country learned to listen the way other people read a newspaper. The land told its story in quiet sounds. The wind brushing dry grass, the distant creak of a fence post, the occasional call of an owl gliding somewhere across the fields. Tonight the prairie sounded calm, yet Elias had learned long ago that calm did not always mean finished. Clara remained on the porch with her lantern resting on the railing beside her. She had tried to step inside and sleep, but something about the night kept her awake. The ranch had belonged to her family for years, and she knew the land the way some people knew the streets of a town. Earlier that evening, everything had felt ordinary. The horses were fed, the gate latched, the prairie quiet beneath the setting sun. Then 12 riders appeared like a storm drifting across the horizon. Now they were gone again, but the memory of their presence still hovered in the air like dust that had not quite settled. Clara folded her arms against the cool wind and watched the faint trail leading away from the ranch. She wondered where those men were riding now, and whether they were still thinking about the quiet cowboy who had stepped from the shadows of the barn. Inside the hayloft, Elias picked up the small silver horseshoe pendant resting against his chest and turned it thoughtfully between his fingers. The metal caught the moonlight in a dull reflection. It was a small thing, hardly noticeable to anyone who did not look closely, but like many small objects on the frontier, it carried a story longer than the road itself. Elias lowered the pendant again and leaned forward to glance through the loft window toward the house. He could see the soft glow of Clara's lantern still burning on the porch. The sight made him pause for a moment. Ranchers on lonely land often learned the same lesson sooner or later. Sometimes the difference between trouble and peace came down to whether someone chose to stand their ground or walk away quietly. After another minute, Elias settled back against the beam and closed his eyes, though he did not truly sleep. Outside, the wind shifted once more and the prairie grass whispered across the dark fields. Far beyond the ranch fences, where the hills began to rise like shadows against the horizon, a distant flicker of light appeared briefly and then disappeared again, as if someone far away had shielded a lantern. It was small enough that Clara did not notice from the porch. But in the hayloft, Elias Carter opened his eyes again slowly, because men who rode the frontier learned that sometimes the night was only beginning to tell its story. The faint flicker beyond the hills lingered in Elias Carter's mind long after it vanished, like a whisper carried across miles of empty land. In the hayloft he remained still, leaning slightly toward the open window while the cool prairie air moved through the barn. The moon had begun its slow drop toward the western horizon, and the night felt thinner now, the way darkness does just before the first hint of dawn begins to consider the sky. Below him the horses shifted quietly in their stalls, calm and untroubled, their steady breathing blending with the gentle creak of old wooden beams. Elias reached for his Stetson and placed it back on his head, the worn brim settling low across his brow. The small bullet hole along the left edge caught a sliver of moonlight before disappearing again in shadow. Outside, Clara Whitmore still stood on the porch with the lantern beside her. She had finally taken a seat on the wooden step, her elbows resting lightly on her knees as she studied the quiet pasture stretching beyond the fence. The prairie at night had a way of making a person think about the long road that had brought them to a place like this. Clara had grown up on this land, watching seasons move across the grass like slow waves. She had seen drought years and good harvests, quiet winters and storms that seemed determined to tear the sky apart. But nights like this one stayed in memory for different reasons. The wind lifted a loose strand of her chestnut hair and carried it across her cheek before settling again. She glanced toward the barn where the soft outline of Elias's horse stood near the fence rail. The animal looked strong and patient, the kind of horse that had seen long trails and trusted the rider who guided it. Clara wondered what kind of miles a man had to travel before he learned to stand in the dark the way Elias Carter had earlier, calm as if the night itself belonged to him. In the hayloft, Elias watched the horizon again. The distant hills were only shadows now, but he remembered exactly where that brief light had appeared. Riders sometimes carried lanterns when traveling at night, especially if they had lost the trail or needed to cross rough ground. Still, the prairie between those hills and the ranch was wide and empty. No one traveled it casually after midnight, unless they had a reason. Elias rested his forearms on the window ledge and listened again to the land. A faint breeze moved across the grass, bending the tall stems in slow patterns like water shifting across a lake. Somewhere far to the south a coyote called again, the sound drifting through the darkness before fading into silence. For several long minutes, nothing changed. Then, very slowly, a second flicker appeared on the same distant ridge. It was small and careful, as though someone far away was shielding the lantern from the wind. Elias watched without moving. He did not reach for his revolver, and he did not speak. He simply observed the quiet signal blinking once, and then disappearing again behind the hills. On the porch, Clara finally stood and stretched her shoulders, the tiredness of the long evening beginning to settle in. She picked up the lantern and turned toward the door of the house, thinking that perhaps sleep might come after all. But in the barn loft, Elias Carter remained awake, his eyes steady on the horizon, because on the frontier a man learned that the land often told its next chapter long before the sun rose to reveal it. The night slowly began to loosen its grip on the prairie, though darkness still ruled the land between the distant hills and the quiet ranch. In the hayloft, Elias Carter remained beside the open window, his posture relaxed but his attention steady, the way a seasoned rider listens to the rhythm of a horse beneath the saddle. The faint flicker he had seen earlier had not returned, yet the memory of it remained clear in his mind like a mark left in dry dust. Below him the horses stirred again, one of them nudging softly against the wooden rail before settling once more. The barn carried the familiar smell of hay, leather, and warm animal breath, a scent that belonged to every ranch from Texas to the northern plains. Outside, the sky had begun to pale slightly along the far eastern horizon, though the stars still held their ground across most of the heavens. Elias rested his forearms against the window frame and studied the distant ridge where the small lantern light had appeared earlier in the night. Out here a rider could travel miles under darkness without anyone noticing, but a lantern told its own quiet story. Someone had been out there watching the same land he was watching now. On the porch of the house, Clara Whitmore had finally stepped inside, yet she had not gone far. The door remained slightly open behind her, and the lantern now rested on a small table just inside the entryway. She stood near the window looking across the yard toward the barn, the glass reflecting the soft glow of the flame beside her. The events of the night had left her thoughts restless. 12 riders appearing without warning was not something a rancher easily forgot, even when they rode away peacefully. She watched the dark shape of the barn and wondered whether Elias Carter was asleep or still awake in the hayloft. Something about him carried the quiet weight of a man who had lived through many long roads. Clara had met travelers before, traders, cattle drivers, even the occasional marshal crossing the territory. Yet Elias felt different. Not louder, not harsher, simply steady, like someone who had learned to let the world reveal itself before making any move. Back in the loft, Elias slowly turned the silver horseshoe pendant between his fingers again. The small piece of metal caught a faint trace of the fading moonlight before he let it rest against his shirt. His eyes remained on the distant ridge. Several long minutes passed with nothing more than wind sliding through the prairie grass. Then, just once more, a brief glow appeared in the same place as before. This time it lingered only a heartbeat before vanishing again behind the slope of the hills. Elias watched carefully, his expression calm beneath the shadow of his hat. He did not look surprised. Riders who lived by the frontier understood that land carried more than one story at a time. Some stories passed quietly like travelers on a distant trail. Others eventually arrived at the gate whether invited or not. Elias leaned back slightly from the window and glanced toward the ranch house, where the faint lantern glow still showed through the glass. Dawn would come soon, and daylight often answered questions the night preferred to keep hidden. Yet something told him that when the sun finally rose over the prairie, the quiet ranch of Clara Whitmore might discover that the riders who had left earlier had not truly finished their business with this stretch of land. The first pale line of dawn slowly touched the far edge of the prairie, turning the distant horizon from black to a faint gray that spread quietly across the open land. Elias Carter remained at the hayloft window as the sky began to change, his eyes still resting on the distant ridge where the small lantern glow had appeared during the night. The prairie looked peaceful again, the tall grass moving softly in the early morning wind, as if nothing unusual had ever passed through this stretch of country. Yet the memory of that careful signal still sat in his thoughts like a stone left on a trail marker. Below him the ranch horses began to stir more actively, sensing the coming daylight the way animals always do. One lifted its head and gave a soft breath. into the cool air while another shifted its hooves across the dirt floor. The barn itself creaked gently as the wood warmed under the slow return of morning. Elias adjusted his Stetson slightly and stood from the window ledge, his tall frame stretching easily after the long night. The silver horseshoe pendant rested against his chest, glinting faintly as the first threads of sunlight reached the barn door. Across the yard the ranch house door opened, and Clara Whitmore stepped onto the porch carrying the lantern she had left burning through the night. The flame looked small now against the growing light of dawn. She paused at the top step and breathed in the crisp air of the morning prairie. The eastern sky had begun to glow with a pale orange band that slowly widened across the horizon. Clara watched the pasture and the quiet barn for a moment before stepping down into the yard. The long night had left her tired, but ranch life rarely allowed much rest when the sun began its climb. She crossed the dirt yard toward the well, her boots leaving soft marks in the dust that the breeze would soon erase. From the barn doorway Elias stepped into the morning light just as she reached the bucket beside the well. Clara looked up with a small nod of greeting. "You did not sleep much," she observed. Elias leaned lightly against the fence rail nearby and followed her gaze toward the horizon. "The land was talking," he said calmly. Clara lowered the bucket into the well and listened to the rope creak as it descended. "What did it say?" she asked. Elias watched the distant hills for a moment before answering. "Someone was out there last night." Clara paused, the rope steady in her hands. She turned her eyes toward the same far ridge. In the full light of dawn the hills looked quiet and empty, their slopes painted in soft gold by the rising sun. It was difficult to imagine anyone watching from that distance during the dark hours before morning. "More riders?" she asked quietly. Elias gave a slow nod. "Perhaps." Clara pulled the bucket up from the well and set it on the edge, the clear water reflecting the brightening sky. "The men from earlier?" Elias considered the question before replying. "Men like that usually ride with more than one plan." Clara glanced toward the barn where Elias's horse stood waiting near the fence. The animal lifted its head as if already aware that the road might soon call again. For a moment, both of them stood silently in the fresh light of morning, studying the open prairie that stretched mile after mile beyond the ranch. The land looked calm, the way it often does when a new day begins. But Elias Carter knew that sometimes the quietest sunrise arrived just before a long story finally revealed what it had been waiting to become. Morning fully unfolded across the prairie as the sun climbed above the eastern hills, pouring warm gold across the grasslands that stretched mile after mile around the quiet ranch. The wind carried the clean scent of earth and dry sage while the sky opened wide and clear above the land. Clara Whitmore stood beside the well with the bucket resting near her boots, watching the horizon where the distant ridge now looked calm and empty in the daylight. Beside the fence Elias Carter adjusted the saddle on his horse with slow practiced movements, the kind that came from years spent on long trails where every strap and buckle mattered. The bullet scar along the brim of his old Stetson caught the morning light for a moment before the shadow of the hat settled across his face again. For a while neither of them spoke. The ranch had begun its normal rhythm. Chickens scratched near the fence. One of the horses walked lazily toward the trough. The quiet sounds of morning work slowly replaced the tension that had lived in the night air. Clara finally lifted the bucket and poured water into a tin basin near the porch before turning back toward Elias. "Do you think they will come back?" she asked. Elias rested his gloved hand against the saddle horn and looked once more toward the far hills. In the bright daylight the ridge showed nothing except grass and rock touched by the rising sun. "No," he said calmly after a moment. Clara studied his expression. "How can you be certain?" Elias gave a faint thoughtful smile and brushed a bit of dust from his coat sleeve. "Men who come looking for easy ground do not stay where they are reminded to use their better judgment." Clara considered that answer quietly. The prairie wind lifted her chestnut hair. Again as she leaned lightly against the porch rail. "You could stay a few days," she said after a moment. "The ranch always has room for another rider who respects the land." Elias glanced at the open pasture, then back toward the long trail stretching north beyond the fence. Riders like him often carried the road in their bones. Still, something about the calm ranch and the steady courage of the woman who kept it had left a quiet mark on his thoughts. He rested one boot in the stirrup, but did not mount just yet. "Your land is strong," he said. It stands because the person running it does not step aside when trouble rides through the gate. Clara gave a small smile at that. The frontier does not leave many other choices. Elias nodded once, then finally swung into the saddle with the smooth motion of a man who had done it 1,000 times before. His horse shifted beneath him, eager for the open miles waiting beyond the ranch. For a moment, he looked back toward the house and the wide pasture glowing in the early sun. Clara raised a hand in quiet farewell. Elias tipped the brim of his worn Stetson in return and guided his horse toward the trail leading north across the prairie. Within minutes, the tall figure and the steady horse had begun to fade into the wide golden land, becoming just another rider crossing the frontier. Clara watched until he disappeared beyond a small rise in the grass. The ranch grew quiet again, just a house, a barn, and miles of open sky. Yet the memory of the long night remained like a quiet lesson carried by the wind. Out on the frontier, justice did not always arrive with noise or thunder. Sometimes it rode in quietly, stood its ground beneath the stars, and left again at sunrise without asking for anything except the chance to do what was right.